The first thing people noticed was how calm Sarah moved. Even before anyone knew her name, before the neighborhood Facebook page started buzzing, before the sirens and shouting and finger-pointing, there was that calm. It showed in the way she knelt beside the fire hydrant at the corner of Maple Grove Avenue, checking the cap with steady hands, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. No rush, no drama, just purpose. The early morning sun reflected off the chrome fittings of her equipment as she laid everything out neatly on the curb, each piece placed exactly where it belonged. To anyone watching closely, it was obvious this wasn't a hobbyist playing firefighter. This was muscle memory. This was discipline earned over years of alarms, smoke, and lives hanging in the balance. A few neighbors stood on their porches, coffee mugs in hand, watching with mild curiosity. Some waved. Sarah smiled back, the kind of small, polite smile that said she was used to being observed but didn't need an audience. She wore a faded department t-shirt tucked into work pants, boots scuffed from use rather than fashion. The logo on her chest wasn't flashy, but it meant something. It represented 20 years of running toward danger while others ran away. It represented missed holidays, sleepless nights, and a career spent answering calls without ever asking who deserved help and who didn't. Now retired, she had traded the constant siren calls for a quieter kind of service, volunteering her time to teach communities how to protect themselves before emergencies ever happened. Maple Grove Avenue was exactly the kind of place that needed that help, even if most residents didn't realize it. The houses were close together, the trees mature and dry in late summer, the streets narrow enough that a single poorly parked car could block emergency access. Sarah saw risks everywhere, not because she was anxious, but because she was trained. Where others saw tidy lawns and matching mailboxes, she saw potential ignition points, blocked exits, and outdated fire extinguishers hanging untouched in garages. When she and her spouse had moved in 3 months earlier, she hadn't announced her background or made a show of it. She had simply listened, observed, and quietly started making plans to help. That morning she was preparing for a small demonstration, nothing dramatic. A basic fire safety overview, how to use an extinguisher, how to shut off a gas line, what to do if a fire broke out in the middle of the night. It was the kind of information that saved lives but never made headlines. She had filed the permits, coordinated with the local fire department, and notified the HOA weeks in advance. Everything was by the book, because Sarah had learned long ago that the best way to protect yourself while serving others was to make sure every step was documented. Then there was Patricia Harmon. Patricia didn't move calmly. She never had. Even when she stood still, there was a tension about her, a tightness in her posture, as if she were perpetually bracing for confrontation. She had been the president of the Maple Grove Avenue Homeowners Association for nearly 6 years, and she wore that title the way some people wore armor. Her clipboard was as much a part of her identity as her carefully styled hair and pressed blouse. Rules mattered to Patricia, but not in the abstract way of fairness or order. Rules mattered because they gave her leverage. They gave her the authority to correct, to scold, to remind people that someone was always watching. From her front window, Patricia had been watching Sarah for several minutes now, lips pressed into a thin line. She noticed the hose first, then the equipment, then the small group of neighbors beginning to gather. Each detail clicked into place in her mind, not as signs of community service, but as potential violations. Water usage, unauthorized gatherings, visual clutter. Her thoughts raced through the HOA bylaws the way a prosecutor rehearsed charges, searching not for understanding but for fault. Patricia stepped outside with purpose, heels clicking sharply against the concrete, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't ask questions. She didn't introduce herself, even though Sarah had only seen her once before, at a meeting where Patricia had spoken for nearly 20 minutes straight without once asking for input. Instead, Patricia stopped several feet away, arms crossed, eyes scanning the scene with open disapproval. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice loud enough to carry down the block. Sarah looked up slowly, wiping her hands on a rag before standing. She didn't flinch. She didn't sigh. She simply met Patricia's gaze with the same calm she used when facing panicked homeowners during real emergencies. "Good morning," she said evenly. "I'm setting up for the fire safety drill. It's scheduled for 10. Patricia's eyebrows shot up, as if the idea itself were offensive. "You can't just decide to do something like this," she snapped. "There are rules. This is a residential area." Sarah nodded, already anticipating this. "I know. That's why I submitted He requested to the HOA board and got approval. I also coordinated with the fire department. Everything's cleared." Patricia scoffed, flipping open her clipboard even though Sarah hadn't handed her any documents. "We're under a drought advisory," she said sharply. "You're not allowed to use water like this. It's irresponsible." There it was, the familiar tone, accusatory, certain, unyielding. Sarah had heard it before, usually directed at people who were scared or overwhelmed. She had learned how to respond without escalating. "The demonstration uses minimal water," she explained calmly. "It's within the guidelines, and it's been approved by the city. The purpose is prevention." Patricia's lips tightened further. Prevention didn't interest her. Control did. She looked around at the neighbors now watching openly, sensing an audience. "I don't recall agreeing to this," she said loudly. "And as HOA president, I'm telling you this needs to stop." The contrast between the two women was impossible to miss. Sarah stood relaxed but grounded, her authority quiet and earned. Patricia stood rigid, her authority loud and imposed. One had spent decades responding to crises without recognition, the other thrived on being seen, on asserting power in moments where it wasn't truly needed. A neighbor cleared his throat awkwardly. Another whispered something to her friend. Phones began to come out, not yet recording, but ready. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Glanced around, aware that this exchange was no longer just between two people. It was becoming a demonstration of something larger. "I have the permits with me," Sarah said, reaching toward her bag. "I'm happy to show you." Patricia held up a hand. "I don't need to see anything right now," she said. "What I need is for you to shut this down before it becomes a problem." Sarah paused. Not because she was intimidated, but because she understood something Patricia didn't. Power used recklessly often collapsed under its own weight. "With respect," she said, her voice still level, "this is already approved. It's a public safety event. Stopping it would be the real problem." For a brief moment, Patricia looked genuinely stunned. People didn't usually speak to her like that. Not calmly, not without fear. Her cheeks flushed, and the grip on her clipboard tightened. "You're being very disrespectful," she snapped. "And I won't hesitate to escalate this." Sarah nodded once, a small, almost sad gesture. "That's your choice." Those words landed heavier than any insult. They implied confidence, they implied preparation, they implied that whatever escalation Patricia was considering had already been anticipated and accounted for, and that infuriated her. As Patricia turned sharply and marched back toward her house, phone already in hand, the neighbors exchanged glances. Some recognized the pattern. They had seen Patricia escalate before, over lawns that were half an inch too long, over trash bins left out too late, over parking permits placed slightly crooked on dashboards. But this felt different. This wasn't a resident trying to bend a rule. This was someone trying to teach people how not to die. Sarah watched Patricia go, then calmly returned to her setup. She adjusted a cone, checked her watch, and continued laying out equipment as if nothing had happened. That calm wasn't ignorance, it was resolve. She knew that when authority met service, one of them was about to be tested, and she knew exactly which one would hold. The moral imbalance had been drawn clearly, even before the first siren ever sounded. On one side stood someone who had dedicated her life to protecting others, now doing so quietly, lawfully, and without ego. On the other stood someone who believed power existed to be exercised, not questioned, even if it meant undermining the very safety she claimed to protect. Viewers didn't need to be told who was right. They could feel it. And once they felt it, they wanted to see only one thing. Sarah never talked about her career unless someone asked directly, and even then she kept it brief. There was no dramatic flair in the way she mentioned her years of service, no heroic framing, no stories volunteered for applause. If someone noticed the old burn scar along her forearm or the way she instinctively scanned rooms when entering a building, she would simply shrug it off. To her, 20 years as a firefighter wasn't a badge to wave around. It was a responsibility she had already fulfilled, one she continued to honor quietly, even after retirement. That quietness, that refusal to center herself, was the first reason people trusted her without realizing why. She had joined the department straight out of her early 20s, back when the station still smelled permanently of diesel fuel and coffee, when radios crackled more than they beeped, and when every call felt like stepping into the unknown. Over the years she learned how panic sounded before it showed itself, how fear traveled through a crowd, how a calm voice could slow a racing heart faster than any command ever could. She learned how to listen when people were shouting, how to give instructions without sounding like orders, and how to take responsibility even when circumstances were out of her control. Those lessons stayed with her long after the uniform came off. Retirement hadn't come because she was tired of serving. It came because she had given everything her body could give. Knees that ached in the cold, a shoulder that never quite healed right after pulling someone from a collapsed stairwell. Nights where sleep came in fragments because sirens still echoed in her dreams. When she retired, her captain had shaken her hand and told her she'd earned her rest. She thanked him, meant it, and then asked where the department needed help on the volunteer side. That was Sarah. Service wasn't a phase of her life, it was the through line. When she and her spouse moved to Maple Grove Avenue, it wasn't part of some plan to take charge or insert herself into the community. They wanted quieter streets, a place with trees, somewhere they could finally settle without rotating shifts or emergency call-ins dictating every decision. Sarah had looked forward to mornings without alarms, evenings without radios clipped to her belt, but even in that quieter life, she couldn't turn off the part of her brain that noticed risk. She couldn't ignore the narrow driveways packed with cars, the overgrown hedges brushing against electrical lines, the outdated fire extinguishers she spotted through open garage doors, still sealed in plastic from decades ago. She didn't criticize. She didn't lecture. She started small. When she met neighbors during walks, she introduced herself by name only. If someone mentioned a burned-out outlet or a recent kitchen scare, she offered gentle advice. "If you ever want, I can show you how to shut off your gas line," she'd say casually, like it was no bigger deal than recommending a good plumber. People responded to that. They didn't feel judged or corrected. They felt helped. That calm demeanor wasn't accidental. It was the product of years spent in high-stakes environments where emotional control wasn't just professional, it was life-saving. Sarah knew that when authority figures raised their voices, people shut down. When rules were enforced without explanation, resentment followed. She had seen it play out on Sen. Ease, where cooperation meant survival. So she learned to lead without commanding, to guide without demanding. Even now, years removed from active duty, that approach shaped everything she did. When she decided to organize the fire safety drill, she did it the same way she had approached every operation in her career, methodically, transparently, and by the book. She contacted the local fire department first, not to ask permission, but to coordinate. She submitted paperwork, secured permits, confirmed water usage allowances under the drought advisory, and documented every approval. She notified the HOA not once, but twice, providing dates, times, and outlines of activities. She didn't assume goodwill. She prepared for scrutiny, because she understood that preparation was respect. What she never did was assume authority just because she had once held it. She didn't introduce herself as a retired firefighter unless it was relevant. She didn't correct people unless safety demanded it. She didn't expect gratitude. That restraint made her credibility stronger than any title ever could. People trusted her because she behaved like someone who didn't need to be trusted to do the right thing. On the morning of the drill, her calm was unmistakable. Even after Patricia's confrontation, Sarah didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue for dominance. She didn't reference her years of service as leverage. She simply stated facts, explained procedures, and offered documentation. That choice mattered. Viewers watching this unfold could sense that she wasn't trying to win an argument. She was trying to do a job she believed in. Neighbors picked up on it too. Some of them had lived under HOA rules for years, accustomed to emails filled with warnings and fines, used to feeling defensive in their own homes. Seeing someone stand calmly in the face of that pressure without becoming aggressive was unfamiliar. It was reassuring. Sarah wasn't there to challenge authority for the sake of it. She was there to protect people who might never realize how close they were to danger until it was too late. Her volunteering wasn't performative. She didn't advertise it on social media or use it to build a following. In fact, when someone suggested posting flyers with her credentials on them, she declined. "It's not about me," she said simply. "It's about them knowing what to do if something happens." That sentence alone said more about her character than any resume ever could. She followed rules not because she feared consequences, but because she understood their purpose. Regulations existed to keep people safe, to coordinate resources, to prevent chaos during emergencies. She had seen what happened when people ignored those systems, when ego replaced procedure. So even when she disagreed with a rule, she addressed it through the proper channels. That respect for structure made her impossible to paint as reckless or defiant, no matter how hard someone might try. Emotionally, viewers connected to that integrity before they consciously recognized it. They saw someone who didn't escalate when provoked, someone who stayed focused on community benefit rather than personal validation, someone whose authority came from experience rather than position. That emotional investment mattered because it meant that when conflict inevitably intensified, the audience already knew where they stood. Sarah wasn't perfect. She was tired sometimes. She was frustrated by bureaucracy more than she let on. She had moments where she wanted to snap back, to remind people exactly how much she knew and how much she had sacrificed. But she chose restraint, again and again. That choice wasn't weakness, it was discipline. The same discipline that had kept her steady in burning buildings and chaotic scenes. By the time sirens would later enter the story, by the time authority figures in uniform would appear, viewers didn't need convincing that Sarah was credible. They didn't need exposition or dramatic reveals. They had already seen her values in action. They had watched her respect the rules even when they were used against her. They had seen her prioritize safety over pride, community over conflict. That foundation was everything. Because once viewers trusted her, once they believed in her motivations, they weren't just watching to see what would happen next. They were watching to see fairness restored. They were emotionally invested in seeing calm professionalism stand its ground against loud, misplaced authority. And that investment didn't come from spectacle. It came from credibility built quietly, moment by moment, long before the real confrontation ever began. At first, the notices were small enough to ignore, almost laughable in their precision. A printed warning appeared taped neatly to Sarah's mailbox less than 2 weeks after she and her spouse moved in. It cited a potential lawn height violation, noting that the grass along the eastern edge of the property appeared to exceed regulation length by approximately ½ an inch. Sarah read it once, blinked, and then reread it to be sure she wasn't missing some hidden joke. She trimmed the lawn that evening, not because she felt threatened, but because compliance was easier than conflict. At the time, it felt like a one-off, the kind of overly enthusiastic enforcement that sometimes happened in tightly managed communities. The next notice arrived 3 days later. This one mentioned a recycling bin left visible from the street for more than 2 hours past the approved collection window. It included a time-stamped photograph taken from an angle that could only have been captured by someone standing directly across the street. The image felt invasive, but again, Sarah let it go. She reminded herself that every system had its quirks, and that patience often solved problems faster than resistance. She placed the bin back inside her garage earlier the following week, and thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Within a month, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Emails started arriving in her inbox with subject lines that read less like reminders and more like accusations. Notice of non-compliance. Second warning. Immediate attention required. Each message cited a different infraction, most of them trivial, some of them bordering on absurd. A garden hose coiled too loosely. A vehicle parked slightly beyond the driveway line for 20 minutes. A welcome mat that didn't match the approved exterior color palette. Each email ended the same way, with a polite but unmistakably threatening reminder of potential fines. What stood out wasn't just the volume of communication, but the tone. There was no attempt at dialogue, no offer to clarify or discuss. These weren't messages written to foster cooperation. They were written to assert dominance. Sarah recognized that tone instantly. She had heard it before, not from good leaders, but from people who mistook control for competence. Still, she responded the way she always had. Calmly, briefly, she acknowledged receipt, corrected whatever was mentioned, and moved on. Other neighbors weren't so quiet. During evening walks, people began to stop her, lowering their voices as if discussing something taboo. One mentioned receiving a warning for having a patriotic flag displayed at a slightly incorrect height. Another joked nervously about being timed while loading groceries to make sure their car wasn't left on the street too long. Someone else admitted they'd stopped using their front porch altogether because they were tired of being told it looked cluttered. These weren't rule breakers looking for sympathy. These were ordinary people adjusting their lives to avoid scrutiny. And always behind the warnings was Patricia Harmon. Her presence was everywhere, even when she wasn't physically visible. Neighbors spotted her car idling at the end of the street at odd hours. They noticed her standing just a little too long at the corner, phone held at chest level, pretending to check messages while clearly angling the camera towards someone's yard. Children learned to wave politely when she passed, even though they didn't know why. Adults learned to tense up, bracing themselves for the next email, the next notice, the next thinly veiled threat. Sarah watched it all with growing concern. Not anger at first, but unease. She understood enforcement. She understood structure. What she didn't understand was the fixation. Rules were being enforced not for safety or harmony, but for the sake of enforcement itself. The HOA wasn't functioning like a governing body anymore. It was functioning like a surveillance system. The scrutiny intensified once Patricia learned, through casual neighborhood conversation, that Sarah had been a firefighter. At first, the comments were subtle, a line in an email reminding residents that professional experience does not exempt anyone from community regularity. ONS, a pointed remark during a meeting about people who think their past careers place them above the rules. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't defend herself. She simply continued doing what she always did, following the rules more carefully than most. That only seemed to make things worse. Measurements became more frequent. Sarah noticed Patricia kneeling near her lawn with a ruler one afternoon, carefully checking the grass near the sidewalk. When Sarah opened her door to ask if she could help, Patricia stood abruptly, muttered something about routine checks, and walked away without making eye contact. The next morning, another notice appeared, this time citing a violation that had allegedly occurred during a 24-hour window when Sarah had been out of town. She forwarded the email to the HOA board with a polite request for clarification. She never received a response. Surveillance turned personal. Photos of Sarah's driveway appeared in HOA communications sent to the entire board, highlighting a fire department vehicle parked there briefly while Sarah unloaded training materials. The implication was clear, even if the accusation wasn't stated outright. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about resentment. About someone who didn't like being reminded that authority could exist outside her control. Patricia began attending to Sarah's property with near-daily consistency. Neighbors saw her walking past slowly, eyes scanning, phone ready. They saw her stop, step back, and zoom in. It was no longer subtle, it was obsessive, and yet every action was cloaked in the language of duty, just doing my job, just enforcing the bylaws. If everyone followed the rules, there wouldn't be an issue. Sarah documented everything. She saved emails, she took screenshots, she logged dates and times. Not because she planned to retaliate, but because she recognized escalation when she saw it. In her career, escalation always preceded disaster. Small warning signs ignored too long turned into emergencies. She wasn't going to make that mistake here. What troubled her most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the way Patricia's behavior was reshaping the community. People were no longer relaxed in their own homes. They whispered instead of laughed. They second-guessed harmless actions. They avoided eye contact when Patricia was nearby, not out of respect but fear. That wasn't governance, that was intimidation. The HOA meetings reflected the same pattern. Patricia dominated the agenda, speaking at length about compliance statistics and violation rates, presenting charts that showed an increase in enforcement actions as if it were a sign of success. When residents tried to raise concerns, she dismissed them as emotional or uninformed. When board members hesitated, she reminded them sharply of their obligations. The meetings stopped being forums for discussion and became performances of control. By the time Sarah announced the fire safety drill, the stage had already been set. The drill itself wasn't the beginning of the conflict. It was simply the moment where all the accumulated tension finally found a focal point. Patricia treated the announcement not as a community benefit, but as a challenge. She scrutinized every detail, searching for something, anything, that could justify intervention. Emails multiplied. Questions were asked and then asked again, even after being answered. Requests for documentation were followed by demands for additional documentation. Patricia framed every inquiry as concern, but the underlying tone was unmistakable. She was looking for a reason to stop it. And when she couldn't find one, frustration crept in. That frustration fed the obsession. Patricia began warning neighbors not to attend, citing vague risks and hypothetical violations. She forwarded drought advisories out of context, implying consequences that didn't exist. She spoke about liability without understanding it, about authority without possessing it. The more resistance she encountered, the more determined she became. For viewers, this pattern mattered. It showed that the eventual 911 call wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of weeks of escalating behavior. It explained why Patricia felt justified in taking such an extreme step. In her mind, escalation wasn't wrong. It was necessary. She had convinced herself that she was the final barrier between order and chaos, even as her actions created the very disorder she claimed to prevent. Audiences stayed engaged because they recognized the signs. Many had lived under similar authority figures. They had seen small rules weaponized, had felt that creeping anxiety of being watched, measured, corrected. They knew where this was heading, even if they didn't know exactly how it would unfold, and that anticipation kept them watching. The breaking point wasn't about water usage or permits. It was about control slipping away. The drill represented something Patricia couldn't tolerate, a situation where someone else held legitimate authority, where rules were followed but not wielded as weapons, where the community gathered willingly rather than under threat. To Patricia, that wasn't service, it was insubordination. And so the pattern tightened like a coil. Each warning, each photo, each email added another layer of pressure. Each unchallenged overreach reinforced the belief that escalation worked. By the time Patricia reached for her phone on the morning of the drill, dialing a number meant for real emergencies, it felt to her not like a reckless act, but like the inevitable next step. To everyone else, it was something else entirely. It was the moment when petty enforcement crossed into abuse, when obsession replaced judgment, when authority, unchallenged for too long, finally overplayed its hand. By the time the fire safety drill arrived on the calendar, it already felt heavier than it should have. On paper, it was simple. A Satu Rode morning demonstration. A few cones set out on the cul-de-sac. A short talk about prevention, followed by hands-on instruction for anyone who wanted it. The permits were approved. The fire department had signed off. The HOA board, after weeks of back-and-forth emails and one tense meeting, had formally acknowledged it. Nothing about the drill was secret, rushed, or improvised. It was announced openly, calmly, and repeatedly, giving everyone more than enough time to understand what was happening and why. Flyers had gone out 2 weeks earlier, tucked into mailboxes and pinned to the community board near the entrance. The language was straightforward and reassuring. Neighborhood fire safety and preparedness drill. No sensational wording, no urgency designed to scare people, just information, the time, the location, the purpose. Sarah had even included her personal contact information, inviting questions or concerns ahead of time. A few neighbors had reached out, mostly to say thank you or to ask if kids could attend. She answered every message politely, patiently, always emphasizing that participation was optional and that the goal was education, not disruption. On the HOA side, the approval had been reluctant but official. During the board meeting, Patricia had argued at length, citing drought advisories, liability concerns, and vague references to setting precedents. Her objections had been sharp and theatrical, delivered with the kind of intensity that suggested she be believed opposition itself was proof of leadership. The rest of the board had listened, weary but cautious. When Sarah presented her documentation, walking them through permits, water usage limits, and coordination with the fire department, the room had gone quiet. There was nothing left to argue against. The vote passed. The approval was recorded. Patricia made sure to note on the record that she strongly disagreed. That disagreement didn't disappear. It simmered. On the morning of the drill, Maple Grove Avenue looked different. Not dramatically so, but enough to signal that something out of the ordinary was happening. Cars lined the street more neatly than usual, residents having been asked to leave space for emergency access. Folding chairs appeared on driveways. Parents walked with their children toward the cul-de-sac, curiosity and mild excitement in their expressions. This wasn't fear-driven attendance. It was interest. It was the kind of turnout that came from people feeling included rather than commanded. Sarah arrived early, as she always did. She wore the same faded department shirt, the same scuffed boots. She checked her watch, reviewed her checklist, and began setting up. Each step followed the plan she had rehearsed in her head days earlier. Cones placed at measured distances, equipment laid out neatly, sign-in sheet secured, water source checked and capped, ready but controlled. Nothing was left to chance, because Sarah didn't believe in improvisation. And safety was involved. Neighbors greeted her warmly. Someone handed her a coffee. Someone else thanked her for organizing the event. A retired couple asked if it was okay to just watch without participating. "Of course," she said, smiling. "This is your neighborhood." The mood was calm, almost pleasant. Conversations drifted between safety tips and weekend plans. Kids pointed at the equipment, asking questions. There was a sense, subtle but real, that this was something positive, something constructive. For a neighborhood that had grown tense under constant enforcement, this felt like a rare moment of collective ease. Then Patricia arrived. She didn't come early. She came precisely on time, stepping out of her car as if making an entrance. She wore a crisp blazer despite the warm morning, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. Her expression wasn't curious or cautious. It was set, determined. She paused at the edge of the gathering, scanning the scene with narrowed eyes, taking in the cones, the hoses, the small crowd. For a moment, she said nothing, as if measuring the size of the challenge in front of her. People noticed. Conversations quieted. A few neighbors exchanged looks. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The atmosphere changed, not because anything had happened yet, but because everyone knew something might. Patricia walked forward, heels clicking against the pavement, stopping just short of where Sarah stood, addressing a small group. She didn't wait for a break in conversation. She didn't raise her hand or ask to speak. She spoke over Sarah's words, her voice cutting through the gathering with practiced authority. "This event is not authorized to proceed in this manner," she announced. The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Sarah stopped mid-sentence and turned to face her. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked resigned. She had anticipated this moment, even if she had hoped it wouldn't come. "Good morning, Patricia," she said evenly. "The event is authorized. The board approved it, and the permits are in place." Patricia shook her head sharply, as if dismissing a lie. "I warned you about this," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. We are under a drought advisory. You are setting a dangerous precedent by using water in a residential area." There it was again. The same argument, delivered as if it were new, as if the weeks of documentation, approvals, and explanations had never happened. Sarah took a breath, steadying herself. "The water usage is within city guidelines," she replied calmly. "It's been approved by the fire department. We've limited it specifically to comply with the advisory." Patricia laughed, a short, humorless sound. "That's your interpretation," she said. "As HOA president, I have a responsibility to stop activities that put the community at risk." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "This again." Another neighbor crossed their arms, frustration evident. A parent pulled their child a little closer, not out of fear but discomfort. Sarah could have raised her voice. She could have listed her credentials, reminded everyone of her years of service. She could have challenged Patricia publicly, turning the moment into a confrontation. Instead, she did what she always did. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "These are the permits," she said, holding them up. "This is the approval email from the board, and this is the fire department's coordination notice. If you have concerns, we can review them after the demonstration." Patricia didn't look at the documents. She didn't step closer. She didn't ask to verify anything. Her jaw tightened. "I am telling you right now to shut this down," she said. "If you don't, I will escalate." The word landed like a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Sarah met her gaze, unflinching. "You're free to do what you think is necessary," she said quietly. "But this event is proceeding." For a split second, time seemed to slow. Everyone present felt it. That invisible line had been crossed. This was no longer a disagreement behind closed doors or an exchange of emails. This was public. This was a challenge of authority in front of witnesses. Patricia looked around, realizing the eyes were on her now, not just curious eyes but skeptical ones. People weren't nodding along. They weren't backing her up. They were waiting, watching, some with arms crossed, some tones half raised, uncertain whether to record or not. The anticipation was palpable. Viewers, like the neighbors, could feel that something was about to give. The question wasn't whether Patricia would back down. It was how far she would go. She took a step back, pulling her phone from her pocket. "You're leaving me no choice," she said sharply. "I won't be responsible for what happens next." Sarah said nothing. She simply turned back to the group and continued where she had left off, her voice calm, her posture steady. That choice spoke louder than any argument. It signaled confidence. It signaled preparation. It signaled that whatever escalation was coming had already been accounted for. As Patricia walked away, phone pressed to her ear, the crowd buzzed with nervous energy. People whispered. Someone shook their head. Someone else sighed deeply as if bracing for impact. Children sensed the tension and fell quiet. The drill hadn't even begun, and already it felt like the most important moment was still ahead. That was the tipping point, not because water would be used, not because a rule might be broken, but because authority, used recklessly for weeks, had finally chosen a public stage. The drill became more than a safety lesson. It became a test of credibility, of power, of whether calm, documented service could withstand loud, performative control. And once that test was set in motion, no one there was willing to look away. The drill had barely begun when the shift in energy became impossible to ignore. Sarah had just finished explaining the basics of fire extinguisher use, her voice steady, her tone instructional, when the sound cut through the air. At first it was distant, almost easy to mistake for traffic from the main road. Then it grew louder, clearer, a wail that rose and fell with unmistakable urgency. Sirens, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned instinctively toward the sound. Children looked up at their parents, confused. A few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, already suspecting what was happening before it fully registered. Sarah paused, listening, her expression tightening just slightly. She knew that sound better than most. She could tell the difference between a unit passing by and one heading straight toward a call. This one wasn't passing. Patricia stood several houses down, phone pressed to her ear, posture rigid. She wasn't pacing, she wasn't agitated. She looked satisfied, as if the situation unfolding was confirmation of something she had already decided was true. The sirens grew louder, echoing off the houses as a patrol car turned onto Maple Grove Avenue, lights flashing. The sight alone was enough to jolt the neighborhood into full attention. People stepped back instinctively, creating space. Phones came out now, not halfway, but fully raised. This was no longer a dispute. This was an official response. The patrol car slowed, then stopped near the center of the cul-de-sac. An officer stepped out, hand resting near their radio, eyes scanning the scene quickly. Training took over. Crowd, equipment, hoses, water source. Sarah watched carefully, recognizing the posture of someone assessing a potential hazard with limited information. She raised her hands slightly, palms open, not in surrender, but in transparency. Before the officer could speak, Patricia hurried forward, her voice aura. AD raised. "I'm the one who called," she said, breathless but controlled. "There's unauthorized water usage happening here. They're violating drought restrictions and creating a safety hazard." The words came out rehearsed, almost polished. Not panicked, not confused. Deliberate. The officer looked from Patricia to Sarah, then back again. "Ma'am," they said evenly, "can you tell me exactly what's going on?" Patricia gestured broadly at the setup, as if the evidence spoke for itself. "They're running hoses, using water, conducting some kind of fire drill without proper authorization. I warned her multiple times. She refused to stop." Sarah stepped forward slightly, careful not to crowd the officer. "Officer," she said calmly, "this is a permitted fire safety demonstration. We coordinated with the fire department. The water usage is minimal and within guidelines." The officer nodded slowly, absorbing both versions. This wasn't a chaotic scene. There was no smoke, no fire, no visible emergency. That alone raised questions. They turned back to Patricia. "Did you observe an immediate threat to life or property?" Patricia hesitated just for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but it was there. "Yes," she said firmly. "Misuse of water during a drought is a serious violation. If something goes wrong—" The officer held up a hand gently. "Ma'am, I need specifics. Was there a fire, an injury, any immediate danger?" "No," Patricia snapped. "But that's not the point. This show, old, never have been allowed in the first place." That sentence shifted the tone. It reframed the call not as a response to an emergency, but as an attempt to enforce authority through law enforcement. The officer's posture changed slightly. Still professional, still neutral, but more alert. As if on cue, another set of sirens approached, this time deeper, heavier. A fire department vehicle pulled up behind the patrol car, lights flashing but siren cutting off quickly. The crowd murmured. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. She hadn't requested this response, but she wasn't surprised by it either. The fire department had been aware of the drill. They had planned to have a unit nearby as part of the coordination, precisely to avoid misunderstandings like this. The fire engine door opened, and Fire Chief Rodriguez stepped down. There was a subtle but immediate shift in the atmosphere. Even those who didn't know him by name recognized the authority in the way he carried himself. He scanned the scene, taking in the equipment, the crowd, the officer, and finally Sarah. Recognition flickered across his face. "Sarah?" he said, surprise mixed with concern. "Yes, Chief," she replied. Patricia's expression faltered, just slightly, enough to notice. Chief Rodriguez turned to the officer. "What's the issue here?" The officer explained briefly, choosing words carefully. "We received a report of unauthorized water usage and a potential safety violation during a drought." Chief nodded, then looked back at Sarah. "This is the drill we approved." "Yes," Sarah said. "All permits are in the folder." She handed them over without hesitation. Chief Rodriguez flipped through the documents quickly, already familiar with most of them. He nodded once, then turned toward Patricia. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm but firm, "this event is authorized. The water usage is compliant. There is no violation here." Patricia's composure cracked. "That's not what I was told," she said sharply. "As HOA president, I have a duty to—" Chief Rodriguez cut in, not raising his voice but leaving no room for argument. Your HOA does not override city permits or fire department operations. Calling 911 for a non-emergency interferes with real emergency response. The words landed hard. The crowd fell silent. Phones captured everything now. Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face flushed, anger and disbelief colliding. The officers shifted their weight, looking at Patricia with new seriousness. "Ma'am," they said, "I need to ask you again. Were you aware this was a permitted event when you called?" Patricia hesitated longer this time. Seconds stretched. Everyone felt it. I disagreed with the approval," she said finally. "That's not what I asked," the officer replied. "Were you aware it was approved?" "Yes," she admitted, voice tight. The officer nodded slowly. "Then you understand that calling 911 under those circumstances may be considered a false rep." "Ort." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "She knew." Another shook their head in disbelief. Patricia's voice rose, desperation edging into it now. "I was trying to protect the community." Chief Rodriguez met her gaze steadily. "Protection doesn't look like this," he said. "It looks like prevention, which is exactly what Sarah was doing." The contrast was undeniable. One person had calmly followed every rule, prepared every document and focused on education. The other had escalated to emergency services to assert control. Viewers didn't need narration to understand what they were seeing. The moral imbalance was now fully exposed, not through shouting or spectacle, but through facts and authority responding in real time. The officer spoke again, measured and clear. "At this point the drill can continue. I'll need your information, ma'am," they said to Patricia, "and we'll document the call." Patricia stood rigid, jaw clenched, as the consequences of her decision settled in. The sirens that had arrived to enforce her will now underscored her mistake. The attention she had sought now worked against her. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She thanked the officer and the chief quietly, then turned back to the group. "Let's continue," she said gently. "As I was saying, always aim at the base of the fire." The normalcy of that sentence, delivered in the middle of chaos, was striking. It grounded the moment. It reminded everyone why they were there in the first place. As the drill resumed, the tension didn't vanish immediately, but it transformed. It became something else. Relief, validation, a sense that truth had held. For viewers, this was the peak, the sirens, the confrontation, the exposure. Everything they had been anticipating converged into a single, irreversible moment. The call that was meant to shut things down had instead pulled the curtain back, revealing not just who was right, but who had crossed a line. And once that line was crossed, there was no dialing it back. The moment didn't explode the way moments like this sometimes did. There was no shouting match, no dramatic arrest, no sudden rush of chaos. Instead, it unfolded with a quiet finality that felt heavier than noise ever could. The kind of moment where everyone present realized at the same time that something irreversible had just happened. Fire Chief Rodriguez stood near the patrol car, permit still in his hand, his posture relaxed but unmistakably authoritative. He didn't rush, he didn't posture, he didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the balance of the scene. Years of command showed in the way he assessed the crowd, the equipment, the calm continuation of the drill, and finally Patricia standing rigid near the curb, clutching her phone as if it could still save her. "This drill was coordinated weeks ago," he said, not loudly but clearly enough that those closest leaned in to hear. "The department reviewed it, approved it, and assigned ED personnel to be on standby. Everything happening here today is compliant." He looked around as he spoke, not dramatically but deliberately, making sure the words landed not just with Patricia, but with the neighbors who had gathered. This wasn't a private correction. It was a public clarification. Patricia shook her head, lips pressed tight, as if refusing to accept the reality forming around her. "That may be your department's position," she said, trying to recover some footing, "but as HOA president—" Chief Rodriguez raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. The gesture was calm, almost gentle, but it carried weight. "HOAs do not supersede municipal authority," he said, "and they certainly don't dictate emergency service operations." That was it. That was the line that changed everything. The officer standing nearby shifted slightly, turning their body toward Patricia. Attention sharpened now that the facts were no longer in dispute. The crowd noticed. Neighbors who had lived for years under Patricia's strict enforcement saw it too. The subtle but unmistakable transfer of credibility. Sarah stood a few steps back, hands clasped loosely in front of her, watching quietly. She didn't insert herself into the exchange. She didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for her. Patricia's voice wavered as she tried again. I was acting in the best interest of the community. I believed there was a violation. Chief Rodriguez met her gaze steadily. You were informed. Ree was not, he replied. Multiple times. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, but the heavy kind. The kind where people process not just what was said, but what it meant. Phones remained raised, recording every second. A few neighbors exchanged looks that carried years of unspoken frustration. This wasn't just about today. This was about everything that had led up to it. The officer cleared their throat. Ma'am, they said evenly, you acknowledged that you knew this event was approved when you called 911. Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her shoulders sagged just slightly. I disagreed with the approval, she said, weaker now. The officer nodded once, making a note. Disagreement doesn't constitute an emergency. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. It stripped away the justification, leaving only the action itself. A misuse of emergency resources, a line crossed. Around them, murmurs spread. Someone whispered she knew. Another neighbor shook their heads slowly, disbelief etched across their face. A woman near the back folded her arms, eyes fixed on Patricia with a mix of anger and relief. It was the first time many of them had seen her without the shield of unquestioned authority. Chief Rodriguez turned slightly, addressing the group now. This drill can continue, he said. There is no hazard here, no violation, and no reason for concern. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. The tension that had been coiled tight since the sirens arrived finally loosened. Parents relaxed their shoulders. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. The fear of escalation gave way to something else entirely. Validation. Patricia stood alone in it. For the first time since she had taken on the role of HOA president, she wasn't directing the narrative. She wasn't issuing warnings or citing bylaws. She was being corrected, publicly and decisively, by an authority she could not override. The officer asked for her identification. Patricia handed it over stiffly, eyes darting briefly toward the neighbors watching. This wasn't part of the script she had imagined. The call had been meant to assert control, to force compliance, to shut the drill down. Instead, it had illuminated her actions under the clearest possible light. Sarah watched the exchange without expression. No satisfaction, no vindication written across her face, just quiet attentiveness. When Chief Rodriguez returned the permits to her, she accepted them with a nod. Thank you for coming, she said simply. Of course, he replied. You did everything right. That statement echoed louder than it seemed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was definitive. It affirmed what many neighbors had already sensed, but hadn't dared to articulate. Sarah wasn't the problem. She never had been. As the officer finished documenting the call, Patricia tried once more to reclaim some dignity. This isn't over, she said, voice tight. There will be consequences. The officer oaked up from their notes. There already are, they replied calmly. The weight of that realization settled visibly on Patricia. Her posture stiffened, then deflated. She glanced around, meeting the eyes of neighbors who no longer looked away. There was no applause, no cheers, just quiet recognition, the kind that couldn't be undone. When the patrol car eventually pulled away, lights off now, and the fire engine followed shortly after, the street felt different, not triumphant, not celebratory, just clear, as if a fog had lifted. Sarah stepped forward again, reclaiming her place at the center of the drill without comment. All right, she said gently, voice steady as ever. Let's continue. People leaned in, not just out of interest in fire safety, but out of respect. The moment had bonded them in a way no HOA meeting ever had. They had witnessed accountability in real time. They had seen authority challenged not with aggression, but with preparation and truth. Patricia remained on the edge of the gathering for a few moments longer, uncertain now. The clipboard hung uselessly at her side. No one approached her, no one argued, no one needed to. The exposure had done its work. Eventually, she turned and walked back toward her house, steps slower than before, shoulders tense. The attention she had once commanded followed her only in silence. As the drill continued, conversations buzzed quietly. People exchanged looks, subtle nods, brief comments. About time. She went too far. I can't believe she called 911. The story was already spreading, not through exaggeration, but through fact. Everyone there had seen it with their own eyes. For viewers, this was the payoff they had been waiting for. Not a dramatic downfall, but a clean one. A moment where the truth surfaced without distortion, where calm professionalism met reckless authority and didn't flinch, where power, stripped of legitimacy, simply fell away. Patricia's regret wasn't expressed in words or tears. It was visible in the way she had been exposed, not as a protector of the community, but as someone willing to misuse emergency services to maintain control. And that exposure, once witnessed, could never be unseen. The drill ended later that morning without incident. People thanked Sarah as they left, some shaking her hand, others offering quiet words of appreciation. She accepted them politely, redirecting credit back to preparedness, to community, to the importance of looking out for one another. But long after the equipment was packed away and the cones removed, the memory of that moment remained. The moment when authority overreached, when service stood firm, when truth arrived calmly, decisively, and in front of everyone. And for the first time in a long time, Maple Grove Avenue felt lighter. The days after the drill didn't erupt into chaos or celebration. There were no confrontations in the street, no shouting matches across fences, no dramatic scenes that would have satisfied a thirst for revenge. Instead, what followed was quieter, steadier, and far more lasting. Accountability began to take shape not through anger, but through process. That same evening, the HOA's private Facebook group lit up. Not with speculation, but with first-hand accounts. Neighbors who had been present shared exactly what they had seen and heard. No exaggeration, no embellishment, just facts, the sirens, the officers' questions, the fire chief's clarification, Patricia's admission that she had known the drill was approved. People who hadn't attended read in silence, scrolling through comments that echoed the same sentiment over and over. This time, it had gone too far. By morning, formal complaints had been submitted to the HOA board by residents who had previously stayed quiet. Some were about the 911 call itself, others reached further back, referencing months, sometimes years, of excessive enforcement, surveillance, and intimidation. What made these complaints different was their tone. They weren't emotional outbursts, they were detailed, documented, and calm. Dates, emails, photos, patterns. The board could no longer dismiss concerns as isolated dissatisfaction. The volume alone demanded action, an emergency HOA. Meeting was scheduled within 48 hours. When the meeting began, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The room was fuller than it had been in years. Neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder, not whispering this time, but waiting. Patricia sat at the front, posture rigid, her usual confidence replaced by something more brittle. She attempted to open the meeting as she always had, but one of the board members interrupted gently and asked that another member take the floor. That small moment spoke volumes. As the discussion unfolded, residents shared their experiences one by one, not angrily, not dramatically, just honestly. A warning issued over a trash bin, a photo taken without consent, a threatening email over a minor infraction, a sense of being watched in their own homes. When the 911 call was mentioned, the room went still. It wasn't framed as a mistake. It was framed as a misuse of authority that put real emergency resources at risk. Patricia tried to defend herself, repeating familiar phrases about duty and responsibility, but they no longer landed the way they once had. The room wasn't hostile. It was resolute. People weren't looking to punish her. They were looking to stop the behavior. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the board called for a vote. The decision was unanimous. Patricia's enforcement powers as HOA president were revoked effective immediately. She would retain a nominal title until the next scheduled election, but she would no longer issue warnings, levy fines, conduct inspections, or represent the HOA in disputes. Those responsibilities were reassigned temporarily to a rotating committee with oversight and transparency requirements. There was no applause, no cheering, just a collective sense of release. Patricia sat silently as the decision was announced, her clipboard resting untouched on the table. For the first time, the authority she had wielded so confidently had limits placed on it, not out of spite, but necessity. The legal process moved separately, methodically. The police report from the day of the drill had been forwarded, along with statements from the officer and the fire chief. The district attorney's office reviewed the case and determined that the 911 call met the threshold for false reporting. Not because Patricia had been confused, but because she had knowingly reported an emergency that did not exist. When the charges were filed, there was no spectacle. Patricia was not arrested in front of cameras. She was notified formally and instructed to appear in court. The case resolved quietly, the way most real cases do. She entered a no-contest plea. The consequences were firm but measured. A fine, probation, mandatory community service hours, a requirement to complete a course on appropriate use of emergency services. The judge made it clear that the sentence was not meant to humiliate, but to reinforce responsibility. The irony of the community service assignment did not go unnoticed. Patricia was assigned to complete her hours assisting with community safety outreach, under supervision and alongside Sarah's volunteer program. When Sarah was informed, she didn't laugh, she didn't object, she didn't comment at all beyond a simple acknowledgement. If there was satisfaction, it wasn't visible. She understood something important. Justice wasn't about watching someone fall. It was about ensuring harm didn't continue. Their first interaction in that setting was brief and formal. Patricia avoided eye contact. Sarah treated her like any other volunteer. Clear instructions, neutral tone, no references to the past, no judgment, just work. That, more than anything, underscored the difference between them. As weeks passed, the neighborhood began to feel different. Emails from the HOA became shorter, clearer, and far less frequent. Enforcement notices dropped sharply. When issues were raised, they were handled through conversation rather than threat. People started leaving their porch lights on again. Children rode bikes without glancing nervously down the street. Conversations lingered longer at the mailbox. Trust, once eroded, began to return. Sarah continued volunteering just as she always had. The drill became an annual event, formally adopted by the HOA with enthusiastic support. Attendance grew each year. Parents brought friends from neighboring streets. Local businesses donated supplies. The fire department increased its involvement. What had once been a point of conflict became a point of pride. And Sarah remained the same through it all. She didn't speak publicly about Patricia. She didn't tell the story for attention. When asked about that day, she framed it simply. It worked out, she'd say. The important thing is that people learned something useful. That restraint preserved her credibility in a way no victory lap ever could. The community respected her not because she had won, but because she had never treated it as a contest.